start off talking about what you've been doing specifically, what meetings you've gone to, what cool things have you seen, stuff like that. Anybody.
So yeah, this is my last day at COP. Tomorrow I'm heading back to Washington State, and so I've been here. This is my 5th day, and I've been following various things. One of the first things I followed was Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. So you all might know that the Paris Agreement sets out nationally determined contributions that each country sets for themselves, and then has various ways to hold them accountable. One of those ways that they can meet those NDCs is through cooperative emissions tracking, and that's sort of what Article 6 is following. Article 6 is important because it can mean that it establishes basically a market for carbon emissions, and it can incentivize countries to trade their emissions to help meet their nationally determined commitments. And it's sort of a controversial article, but the purpose of it is to stop CO2 emissions from increasing and sort of cap it. And so the countries can trade to meet their NDCs that are supposedly set so that CO2 emissions won't increase anymore. I've also attended a couple other talks. I just came from a talk with Secretary of State John Kerry, who you all may be familiar with. He gave a short presentation basically calling governments to action and saying that basically, if we don't demand accountability in our democracies, then shame on us because we have a voice to do so. And not everyone has that voice. And he also gave some anecdotes about how he was traveling to New Zealand, and one of their scientists down there told him that they were basically, we were already passing tipping points without knowing whether or not we'll be able to bounce back from them. So the sooner we act, the better. And yeah, I'll let the others share too.
Yeah, so this is my 2nd day. So I've been mostly attending what are called side events. And so they're lower profile individuals usually. And instead of including the negotiation conference rooms, which are sometimes hard to follow, and as Christian and I learned yesterday, just a lot of arguing about very specific word choices. So I chose so far to spend more time in the side event rooms that have more lower level officials speaking to smaller audiences, and there's a more interactive feel because audience members can ask questions at the end of the panels. And that's been really interesting. One that I went to yesterday that's pretty relevant to my research topic was about, there was a lieutenant governor from Wisconsin actually was talking about how we need to make our cities more walkable. And so thinking about that from a public transportation perspective as well was interesting because if you have, like in the US, our homes and our residential districts and malls and stores and commercial districts are really separated. And so it creates a lot of difference in accessibility and there's not a lot of walkability in our cities. And so thinking about how we can merge those two together, like a lot of European cities, and I've lived in Mexico and Puerto Rico, and they have that same kind of integration of all of those kinds of districts together. So it was really interesting hearing government officials and also that topic was specifically the US, Canada, and Mexico talking about North American strategies to meet our NDCs. And so thinking about how expanding different ways of public transportation and making our cities more walkable will have a really large scale effect on the greenhouse gas emissions that are happening in all of those countries. Other than that, I have gone to a couple of panels with some other students about plastics and how it's really important for us to have more sustainable packaging, because if we think about international trade and anytime you buy food products or clothing products, you have plastic wrapping and packaging, and it's coming from somewhere else, so you have the shipping costs of that as well. And so thinking about how our things, right, our material goods that we have a lot of impacts and a lot of factors that we don't necessarily see. And so thinking about the impacts of those processes.
So I have taken a different route from these two. I don't really have a theme of what I'm going to. Rather, I'm going to an eclectic selection of them, so that way I can analyze how the different levels of people are talking about it. And that's led me to some pretty interesting things, from seeing Al Gore speak to going to an Italian pavilion meeting, which is just like the little alcove where the country is hanging out and putting on their events, to one of those where one of the heads of IKEA was talking and just about some of their business locally, like innovations for cleaning things up. I've also been running a lot of the audio while we're here and just making it work.
So, but you've done interviews throughout, right? Did you do some interviews yesterday?
So a lot of people do not like to be interviewed.
Yeah, I woke up and I just start asking questions, and sometimes they answer, and sometimes they're like, "Oh, okay."
So I have lots of notes, but no one has agreed to let me just like, hello, please talk into this microphone.
Is that right?
No,
Yeah.
I wouldn't do that.
Wow. Wow. Okay.
But that's okay. I got lots to work with.
Okay, good. Right.
So kind of going off of what Amanda and Baxter both said, I think one of the most interesting things to me has been visiting some of the side events and the different pavilions, and really highlighting how everyone here has some kind of investment in wanting to work on climate change, and they're all coming from such various different perspectives, and kind of seeing how all of those come together and still have equal.
So what's the most significant thing that you've observed to this point?
I think probably the panel I went to this morning was really interesting. It was talking about how business and investment can be a really powerful tool for furthering climate technology and implementing green technology in the business sector. And like the European Investment Bank and a lot of other EU organizations are really increasing by a huge factor the amount of money they're putting into green investment. And that was really cool to see how not necessarily scientists, right, but people who really care about this and understand that it's important to develop are getting involved and recognizing the imperative nature of the situation. There were also some business leaders there, which was really cool. There's some like green construction companies and a company in Sweden that makes steel. And so steel is coal and iron right mixed together. And so they're figuring out how to make steel without coal to eliminate that carbon footprint, which is really cool. And so they figured out a chemical process using hydrogen, I think, that to be effective. And so they're starting to scale it up and run different tests at various industrial levels. So that was a really hopeful moment and really cool that there's a lot of adaptive thinking and mitigation of carbon footprint in that way, because we often think of the business sector as not necessarily being as forward thinking sometimes in climate, because there's a lot of, I guess, pressure sometimes for us to wait for market factors and market strategies, market pressure, thank you, to make that happen. And a lot of times it's not as strong on the consumer side. And so it was really encouraging for me to see businesses taking that initiative to limit their carbon footprint.
Instead of waiting until they start to see a movement.
Yeah, well, going off that, at the U.S. Climate Action Center, the United States does not have an actual government-sponsored pavilion here. They have an NGO, the U.S. Climate Action Center, which is hosting events that are themed "We Are Still in It," it referring to the Paris Agreement and climate action. And so I went to a panel yesterday with various CEOs from across the board of American industry, and they were discussing basically ways that one of the ways that they are limiting climate change is there's this agreement that 100 CEOs have signed that basically states their commitment to reducing their carbon emissions. I don't remember the specific details, but that group of business leaders is representative of 42% of the emission profile of the United States, as well as $7.5 trillion in our economy, which is a significant portion. Additionally, another interesting thing that I heard is this idea of a climate positive company. I had never heard that term climate positive before I came to this conference, but it essentially means carbon negative. So your whole life cycle from beginning to end of your process takes CO2 out of the atmosphere. And companies are doing this by planting trees or doing other processes. But there's this company in Sweden called Max Burgers that was the first company to do it. And then there's another one in New Zealand called Mevo Ride Sharing. And both of them negate their carbon emissions and actually have negative emissions overall because of their efforts to restore the environment. So those two things, like going off of what Amanda said, how business is being proactive despite the United States and the federal government's stance on climate change, has been really encouraging to see.
That's really awesome. So I'm going to go ahead and define NGO, a non-governmental organization, just because not everyone who's listening in here may or may not be familiar with that acronym. I'll try to keep us up to date on that throughout this. But I don't know, something that really surprised me was the sheer level of technicality in the negotiations. I sat in there for around 30 to 40 minutes during the Article 6 negotiations, and that entire time it was about whether or not to put brackets around the thing.
Well, a lot of the Article 6 arguments were about some countries felt very strongly that consideration of human rights needed to be included, and other countries felt very strongly that if we politicize the role of human rights in environmental policy, then we need to politicize many other topics. And so there was a lot of clarification and discussion about how to word that and whether or not to include that, which was really enlightening for me.
Yeah,
to see the different perspectives about
it
that.
took them 3 hours to get through 2 paragraphs of Article 6, and they were supposed to get through 3 in 2 hours. So it's just a very tedious and time-consuming process to go word by word through these documents.
How many different countries are represented here? You guys know?
Offhand, I do not.
It's 197 in the world.
You're saying
That's it?
countries?
Yeah,
Yeah.
Every country in the world?
that's right.
It's 197.
197 states. The EU is a state. So it's well,
So it's
it's 200. It's
190.
200 and
But it's 197 of the parties.
197 parties.
And have you guys ever been in a group of, let's say, a dozen that have had to come to a conclusion about writing something or putting something together?
Yeah.
Yeah, it takes a long time.
And those
A
were
lot of
all,
different
those were
opinions.
people, right, of all of the same country and the same language and the same, all of that, right?
Same needs, same perspectives.
And now we've got 197 different,
Yeah.
potentially different languages,
Yeah.
different cultures, different, yeah. So this is pretty remarkable that we can get even through that many paragraphs, right?
Yeah.
Well, especially,
Whole agreement.
yeah, especially considering the different levels of how individuals and countries are going to be affected
Mhm.
by some of these things. There's a lot of, I think, discussion about economic threat in some cases, which is a huge factor for why our administration decided to withdraw. But even listening to the conversations about how they're going to track carbon emissions to then exercise the trading program, that was really interesting, thinking about how you have different levels of industrialization and different levels of carbon emissions happening in a lot of nations. And the idea with the trading program is that if one country isn't meeting or is meeting their NDCs and another country isn't, then they can kind of like switch them off and have some kind of transfer happening. And it kind of seems a little backwards to me to start having those kinds of negotiations, because then essentially you're saying, well, overall it's going down and that's good, but I can still pollute a little more than I said that I would because we're going to have some kind of transfer here. And so that just kind of seems really counterintuitive to the nature of the purpose of the conference. So I don't know, I'd be interested to hear what you guys think about that.
I mean, you guys is this a chemistry class?
These
that's
are,
it.
yeah, they're mostly chemists in there, yes.
All right, so they're probably familiar with the buffer solution. And
It
that's,
should be.
yeah, that's a lot of what this reminds me of. It's, you're you're having this thing in there that's preventing it from going too far in either direction. And that's a lot of what I think about whenever they're like, you can trade off a little bit. So it gives you a range that you can hit now instead of a single point. So since we're aiming for that single point right now as a starting goal, I think this might help to get us there more efficiently, because we're not just guessing and checking all the time, like all randomly.
Yeah. See, that makes sense.
I think I'm just morally against it. I think I just, in my soul, have a problem with that.
Why don't we do what we say we're going to do? And then if we can do better, wouldn't that be awesome, right?
Yeah.
Instead of saying, well, we can't quite do it, so let's trade or something, right? That's your moral dilemma here, right?
Yeah. Morals and logic do not always go hand in hand.
This is true. So do we have any questions from anybody in any audience that's online right now?
Do you guys have questions about what we're learning, or other events we've been to, or something that you're interested in learning about that you think we might have an answer for?
What's your weirdest climate question?
I have a question. Sorry, you can't see me. It's not really weird, but so did you guys learn anything new about the Paris Agreement while you guys were over there?
Yeah, I actually didn't really understand a lot about Article 6. And so through this process, Christian's like, I know so much about it now. Yeah, I think through this process, I've definitely learned a lot about Article 6 being like how we're going to meet our national contributions, and then just a lot about how the negotiation process works. I never sat in a room before where you have to get through 20 people in an hour and each one of them talks for 20 minutes, and they all have just so many very particular things they want to change and want to be represented. So just, I guess what I learned more so was about that process and how negotiations work about things like that.
Yeah, I didn't know too much about Article 6 coming into the COP. On the first day, we have this meeting where everyone sort of in our group, all of the non-governmental organizations and independent groups meet. And like 2/3 of the room were like, I'm following Article 6. And I was like, I don't know what Article 6 is. So I ended up going to the first negotiation, and I was completely lost because there's draft text online, but I didn't have access to that draft text. I didn't know how to get it. And so I couldn't follow really at all. And they're basically just referencing paragraphs this whole time. And I'm like, I don't know what they're talking about. And so I kind of walked out of there just feeling a little like I'm really confused. So I sat down with another member in our group who knows a lot more about the negotiations. I just asked him where I could find the text and like what I should be looking for. And I was able to get access to that document, which is kind of buried on the UNFCCC website. And I went back yesterday and I stayed in there for 3 hours and just followed the negotiations and saw what they were talking about. And it's pretty interesting to see international climate policy like being negotiated right in front of your eyes. But it's also painstaking because you know that some of the things that they're talking about, like every country has to feel like they're heard, and because of that, it goes way over time and people get reiterated. So I found myself frustrated that there wasn't a more efficient way to negotiate. Like they weren't really implementing any technology to help with their negotiations. It was all just word of mouth. And sure, they might have had a Word document open, but I think it would have been a lot easier if there was like some sort of mechanism where you could gauge how much countries disagree with certain statements or not, because that would save a lot of time with how they are like negotiating things. That was just my perspective.
Makes like a view-only Google Doc and just.
It would be really nice.
Yeah.
Hey, that's a really cool idea.
That's your demographic they could bring to the negotiation.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's the voice of the wilderness.
Even a lot of the parties in there were really frustrated about that, and they kept asking the co-facilitator to please have a track changes document so we can see what people have asked to be revised and what's still under scrutiny and what people are still discussing. Like 3 parties in a row were like, yes, we second that. We need to have a lot more clarity on how these conversations are going, because then they go into small group negotiations with their country or their kind of group and talk about what points they want to bring up and what points they support. And so if they come back then to the big group and it's a different from what they just talked about, then that time wasn't used well, and that's really frustrating.
So 2 things. Doctors Floyd and Peter, do you know if they have a suggestion box that we can like give this idea to them? Just out of curiosity.
The UNFCCC has a email that you could.
Cool. We'll send a way to do it to them and see if they take it up. Second.
Let me ask you guys one quick thing. Do you know what it takes to get this, all these words settled on? Like, is it 50-50, right?
Oh, it's
Half of-
unanimous, right? Like
is that
everybody,
right?
I think
Well,
it is,
they
right?
have it in
Everyone has to
brackets
agree on
if
it.
it's like uncertain, but yeah, if it's not brackets, then it's like all good to go. And then the ministers come in. So there's like 2 parts. There's the negotiations, and then there's when the ministers come in, which are the heads of the specific departments that are negotiating policy. And so you have the negotiators, who are primarily just the nitty-gritty technical people that are experts on that document, and then they sort of advise the ministers to choosing which option they think is best for their country, and then in the end, it's up to the ministers to come to a consensus, which is happening this week. So last week was like pure technical negotiations, and then this week it's more deciding what will actually get implemented.
So it does have to be unanimous. Have you ever had instances where you have had to have a unanimous, united front in whatever you're presenting? I mean, it's not
easy at all.
Yes. So the other thing I have is, Christian, since you're more familiar with this than I, could you give just a quick rundown of what Article 6 is? We've talked a lot about it and about the process to making it, but we haven't actually said what it is.
Yeah, so Article 6, I'm not an expert on this. I didn't know what it was before. But basically, it's establishing cooperative emissions trading between companies, so that if they reach their nationally determined commitments, aka NDCs, that they established in the Paris Agreement, they can trade between other countries. Let's say Costa Rica is 98% renewable. They are definitely going to meet their NDC that they set for themselves. They can trade with a larger country, such as like Japan or China, to meet, so that they're able to negate their emissions if they went over, to say they still satisfied their NDCs. That's my understanding of the Article 6.
Yeah, and that's about what I got from it too.
And so they're trying to establish essentially a price, basically? Is that?
Like a trading mechanism.
They're trying to establish a mechanism and like how you go about trading the emissions. That's basically what they were talking about.
Because there has to be some transfer of something back, right? I mean, your example of Costa Rica and Japan.
Nothing's free.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean.
There will be like some sort of transaction.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that's negotiated between the countries or how that technically works.
A deep
I don't think
concern,
they know how it works
a
either.
deep concern, this is Peterman on the side, a deep concern about Article 6 is that there will be double dipping.
Yeah, there's a lot of
You
talk
might
about
explain
too.
that. Do you know what you mean by double
Counting, yeah.
Double count.
Yeah, so if countries that are already, or that haven't met their limit, but then also trade with people, is what you're saying?
Well, if you've met your limit, you're trading it, but
Oh, and then
you
you
count
count
it.
both of those, yeah, so you
Explain.
met your limit, but then you're trading with someone, so like your example about Costa Rica and China, like Costa Rica's already got a lot of renewable energy, so if they trade with China and their trade is that they plant more trees, then there's concern that they'll count that tree planting in their own tally, as well as their trading with China tally. So there's a lot of talk about how to regulate that, because it's really difficult to develop metrics to understand how many, what percentage of emissions are coming from just one country. There's a lot of data involved in that. If you think about cars, energy sources, water, things that get shipped to that country. There's just so much to keep track of. So a lot of really complex conversations about how to develop some kind of metric to keep track of that.
So I have a question for the class. By show of hands, how many of you guys think that planting a tree is universally good? All right, cool. So that actually got touched upon in one of the things that I went to, because a lot of some of these indigenous peoples were like, we know how to take care of the land. Planting more trees will not help, especially the non-indigenous ones. And that's something that a lot of people don't think about whenever you're going into these things, because just planting a tree may cause more harm than good if it's not the right tree in the right place.
The wrong ecosystem.
Yeah, in the wrong ecosystem. So this oversimplification has kind of just permutated. But at the same time, the idea of restoring the forest, say in the Amazon, which has been having a bunch of fires and just getting things cut down, that's a place where we could really use it. And it's this weird dynamic relationship between all these things that has kind of just captured my attention. But what do you guys think on that?
About planting trees.
Yeah, really good all the time, or is there like a specific thing that would be better in some cases?
I mean, I think planting trees is a really good option to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, but as you articulated, it is extremely important to make sure that it's not an invasive species and that it's not going to negatively impact the environment in which you're placing it. But I think that plants are great.
I agree.
I think there are a lot of options. I think putting something that's going to help us take carbon dioxide out of the environment and make oxygen, which we rely on, is a good way. It also helps, like deforestation obviously is a really big problem. And if you have more trees and roots in the soil, it holds the water or the soils in better. And so you decrease the erosion that's going to be happening. And that's really important for landslide prevention and farming. And it helps the water that gets down to the aquifer be cleaner too, because the roots help to kind of filter that out.
So as you can see, this is a bit of a complicated discussion to try and have, which is why we had to actually come out here, meet these people, and have these conversations. Because imagine reading what we just said back and forth to each other, like in an email or just on a piece of paper. There was no inflection, there was no discussion, it was just there.
Here's another quick one. So Dr. Primo and I were giving a community talk, and somebody said, actually you weren't in there, but somebody said there are more trees on the earth today than there were 200 years ago, something like that, right? Have you guys heard of that argument, and have you any rebuttal to that?
I haven't heard of it.
Okay. Anyone else heard?
I
Haven't heard of it.
I don't disagree, just because I don't know enough to disagree. But I do know that there is a lot of focus on deforestation, like in the Amazon and the boreal forest in Canada and in Indonesia. Palm oil comes from a lot of forests in Indonesia. So I know that more trees are getting cut down than I would like to, but I do know that I think we used to rely a lot more specifically on wood for firewood and things like that. So it's possible that our resource use of wood isn't as much as it used to be. But I think the focus then is that we need trees and other plants to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and we have a lot higher carbon emissions than we ever have.
So let me ask you this. If you put a sapling into the earth,
You know this.
and you counted that as replacing or putting 10 in for every one that you cut down, you cut down a 100-year-old tree, what's the issue surrounding that?
I can take that. So that's why I sort of advocate for like doing CCS or some sort of like ambient air capture technology as well as planting trees, because it's more scalable and it takes up less land. There's about 178 countries around the world that are currently doing CO2 utilization in one form or another. CO2 utilization is simply taking CO2 either from a concentrated point source or from ambient air and converting it into a useful material or storing it underground or in a mineral such as rocks. And so, yeah, that is an issue, is that it takes time for it to reach that maturity to sequester the amount of CO2 that the mature tree did. And so that's why I'm choosing to do what I am focusing on with negative emissions technologies, because I think in addition to planting trees, these technologies can be scaled and not be an end-all be-all solution, but help mitigate the increasing emissions that we are witnessing.
So that you hit on the answer that I was looking for, right? The actual maturity of the trees is significant in terms of how much CO2 they're going to remove. And so even if you have 1,000 more trees than you did 10 years ago, those trees are 10 years old.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we have taken up as much time as we said we would with you all. However, we'll still be here because we have another one of these in half an hour. And so if any of you all want to hang out and talk to these guys more, you're welcome. Otherwise, we'll shut down and pick it up again in a half an hour. Thanks for coming, y'all.
Thank you.
Love you, Ariel.